Welcome to Boon TV. It's the Dem Security podcast of the Regional Center for Democracy and Security. I'm the RCDS President Tիգրան Գրիգորյանը, and I'm hosting today RCDS Senior Analyst Կարինա Ավետիսյանը. Կարինա, thank you for coming.
Thanks for having me.
Let's discuss today our recent report we produced in cooperation with the Heinnrich Byöl Foundation that focused on Armenia's structural dependence on Russia. Could you explain to our viewers why this research is significant, especially now?
It's especially significant now given Armenia's attempts to diversify its diplomatic and political ties with the West. Traditionally, as we all know, Russia has been Armenia's security guarantor, main trade partner, and main source of energy. And given the political shifts, it became really kind of important to understand what structural dependencies Armenia has on Russia, given these political changes in the overall kind of geopolitical landscape. So we did this research looking at three main areas, looking at trade, energy, and security. And these are significant also because, in the aftermath of the 2020 Karabakh War, Armenia actually didn't start diversifying even its security ties until 2 years later, until the September 2022 attacks on Armenia. And there's various kind of numbers and shares of resources that we can look at in more detail as we have this discussion. But given this kind of political shift, it was really interesting and important to look at what the main factors of dependencies there were and what kind of realistic ways there are to mitigate those dependencies in the short to long term.
Could you also please present the main findings of the report?
Yeah, in terms of trade, we found, bilateral trade between Armenia and Russia has dramatically increased even since 2020 and doubled to $5.3 billion in 2022. And in 2023, just 1 year later, it surged to $7.3 billion. So these are big numbers, even given the loss of the Karabakh War. And Russia is responsible for more than 1/3 of Armenia's foreign trade. So these are, this is a big dependency. In terms of energy, Armenia is also heavily dependent on Russia. Armenia has limited domestic resources. And in 2023, Armenia imported 86.6% of its natural gas from Russia and 70% of its petroleum oil. So in terms of hydrocarbons, it's majorly dependent on Russia. The energy grid in Armenia, and particularly its gas pipelines, are managed by Gazprom Russia. So that makes short-term substitution and diversification quite difficult. Armenia generates a significant portion of its energy domestically, which seems kind of at first glance advantageous, but a large share of this is electricity and is derived from natural gas and nuclear power, both of which are heavily dependent on Russia. So we have, the Medzamor nuclear power plant, but that runs on Russian technology and nuclear fuel. And not only that, we also found that nuclear waste disposal is also heavily reliant on Russia because Armenia doesn't have the storage facilities for that, which Russia does. Armenia engages in limited electricity exchange trade with Georgia, but because the networks aren't synchronized, that limits the volume of electricity that they can trade.
Yeah, and before moving to the recommendation part of the paper, I think it's really important to emphasize that there are certain solutions, and I think both you and I were less optimistic before writing the report, but it's also important to understand that these solutions are long-term solutions because amid Armenia's attempts to deepen its relationship with the West, there are a lot of conversations that we are going to, pivot to the West overnight, ignoring all of these dependencies. And now, coming back to the paper, what are the main dependencies regarding trade and energy? I think we could discuss the security part later, but I think we've come up with actionable solutions, and if the government of Armenia is willing to do its homework, there are certain solutions. So what are these solutions?
So I just wanted to mention a couple of the other trade vulnerabilities that Armenia has before we move on, and one of them is food security. So that's another major trade kind of component of reliability on Russia. So in terms of wheat, Armenia, the wheat that is imported into Armenia, 99.9% of it comes from Russia, and that's a major kind of political food stuff as well, because obviously it makes bread, and bread is notoriously known to, prices fluctuate significantly and causes political unrest. And vegetable oil, that's another area that Armenia is heavily dependent on Russia. And I also wanted to mention why Russia remains such a key trade partner for Armenia. One of the reasons is that Russia doesn't require higher standards of quality in terms of exports. So Armenian manufacturers aren't kind of forced to adapt and change and kind of improve quality and production in order to find these new markets. It's hard to do that.
Yeah,
and
they are in a comfort zone. So
exactly.
They are known in the market. They speak the language. The standards are lower. So there are no real incentives for business people to basically move towards different markets. And that's one of the things we're probably also going to discuss, that without this proactive approach from the government, it's impossible to expect that the business people themselves will have any incentives to find new markets or to diversify their markets.
Exactly. I think this is one of those top-down solutions for sure. In terms of recommendations for foodstuffs, we found that it's possible to subsidize at least 30% of grain prices to support local producers and to compete with Russian imports. And there's also still a lot of uncultivated land in Armenia, which could be used for agriculture, like wheat cultivation, specifically, so kind of boosting domestic production and, kind of reducing the reliance on imports. And then in terms of energy, we found in terms of energy recommendations, we recommend, just kind of based on, international best practice, one of the obvious things that Armenia can do is modernize its power plants, which it is doing in some areas, but like with the nuclear power plant, which you know more about that.
Yeah, so Armenia needs to build a new nuclear power plant because the deadline for the current one is 2036, and there are ongoing conversations with different partners, with the Americans, South Korea, France, who will be building this new nuclear plant, and there are conversations that it will be a modular one, so it will be a bit different from the current one. This is one area where we can see some practical steps towards diversification. But it's a very complicated process, and of course, the government should hurry because, as I've said, the deadline is 2036.
Yeah, from when the Metsamor goes offline. Yeah. Another key recommendation that we had is to expand renewable energy capacity, particularly solar power, and to explore export opportunities for excess production of that. And solar power, actually, a few of the experts that we spoke to said that solar could particularly help kind of fill the gap in terms of domestic, like home use, natural gas use, as well as transportation. So that could be something to look at.
Yeah, when it comes to energy, we should also mention that there are areas that are difficult to diversify. Let's say the gas imports coming from Russia. Of course, there is the Iran option that was mentioned during our conversations with the experts, but the scale of the Iranian gas that could substitute the Russian imports is very limited, and the state of the infrastructure is also under a huge question mark. We should also mention that the gas pipelines to Iran are also owned by Russia, by Gazprom Armenia, so there are a lot of problems. We had a very interesting insight about petroleum oil. So as you know, Shell International entered the Armenian market several years ago, and now they have about 5-6% of the petroleum share in the Armenian market. And if you compare the prices with the Russian imported petroleum oils, it's like 5-6% higher, which is basically the custom charge that is being imposed on these products by the Eurasian Economic Union, when these products are imported from the European Union. So at first glance, there is a solution. You could get rid of the custom charge, but it is practically and formally impossible because Armenia is part of that union and cannot unilaterally make such decisions. So energy is the most vulnerable part of the dependency because there are not a lot of options. When it comes to trade, when it comes to finding new markets, of course, there are some solutions, and all of our respondents basically singled out the Gulf market. The Gulf market could be an alternative for Armenia's agricultural products, also for the processing industry. But here, as well, as I've already said, the government should take a more proactive stance, because if it doesn't help the producers and the exporters to find these new markets, to basically even subsidize some of the costs, they will never do that because they are basically in this comfort zone with the Russian market and they don't have any incentives to look for something else.
And we also found, when speaking to the experts, that Armenia has begun exporting kind of increasing volumes of produce, of other foodstuffs to the Gulf, and particularly the United Arab Emirates. But there's a shortage or not shortage, I guess there's like limited infrastructure. So airplanes, literally in this case, to transport these foodstuffs that spoil. So.
Yeah, and the transit fee through Iran. We've been told that. Yeah. The government has been negotiating with the Iranian government to reduce these transit fees or even eliminate them, but they haven't been successful so far. But overall, summarizing this section, I think there are things that could be done. When it comes to, for example, the grain dependency on Russia, I think the subsidies for the producers are the solution. We've recently heard a lot of conversations about how we could, mitigate the dependency by switching to rice. That is, of course, not serious, but the government can do a lot in these areas. The government can do a lot helping the exporters and stuff like that. And regarding the Eurasian Economic Union, I think one of the most interesting findings was that Armenia's dependence in terms of rudimentary products on Russia has actually increased since the membership in the Eurasian Economic Union. So we have been exporting much more raw products, more raw agricultural products to the Eurasian Economic Union since the membership in the organization, and that, of course, has simplified the structure of the economy. Now let's move on to the security component of our report. I think this is one of the areas where we have already noticed certain changes. Could you please present what these changes are?
Yeah, absolutely. So some major changes, especially since the 2022 September attack. So essentially it was like a series of events, starting with the Nagorno-Karabakh War of 2020. And the second is Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which created supply disruptions, as well as just kind of showing to the world how Russian military equipment actually performs on the battlefield, which has been kind of less than stellar, as well as that third kind of aspect, the 2022 attacks on Armenia. And the political component of that is important to discuss as well, because in the aftermath of Azerbaijan's attacks on Armenia in 2022, Armenia appealed to the CSTO to intervene, and they essentially didn't do anything. So I think those events altogether created a perception in Yerevan that Russia's not a reliable security partner, and that Armenia needs to begin diversifying its security partners. That was kind of the background of that finding.
So how has the diversification process been going on?
So interestingly, we found that the share of Armenia's arms imports from Russia plummeted from 96% to less than 10% in 4 years. So that's pretty significant. And what Armenia's been doing is in kind of deepening its relations with sort of defense cooperation with specific countries, in particular the Czech Republic, India, and France. And I wanted to talk about actually specifically India and the Czech Republic, because as we found, So Armenia's arsenal overall, even though it's begun diversifying its supplies, is still heavily kind of the share of that is still heavily like Soviet Russian weapons. And Armenia can't get rid of them overnight, still needs them. But in order to kind of maintain that, you need expertise, you need maintenance, you need parts. And if you're not going to rely on Russia, actually Czech Republic and India have experience doing just that. So they would be easily kind of, replacements for Russia in terms of that kind of maintenance and upkeep of that of those weapons. Cooperation with the United States has also increased, but that's kind of focused more on like training, military education, kind of joint exercises and kind of exchanges that they do. So yeah, it's actually interesting to note that, even though the new weapons procurements that they're getting are more expensive, it's kind of clearly worth the cost.
I think you made a very interesting point in the report about that dependency being like deeper when it's one-sided, when it's cheaper, when it's
subsidized.
Like subsidized. Mm-hmm. Could you expand on that a bit?
So there is this kind of, the subsidized nature of Russia's arms transfers to Armenia has deepened this dependency, because when the weapons that are granted reduce the recipient autonomy through subsidies, English. Then you kind of have this form of feudal dominance, right? Where Armenia, as the peripheral client, relies on a single supplier. So this arrangement limits Armenia's sovereignty and creates that vulnerability because disruptions in supplies could occur during times of heightened security tensions, and that's exactly what happened.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened during the 2020 war, when overdependence on one supplier created a lot of problems, including with maintenance. I think we should also emphasize the importance of the arms deal with France. It probably it's not as big as it could be per se, but the fact that a NATO member country has this willingness to cooperate with Armenia in the area of defense is significant and could open potential windows of opportunity for future cooperation. So, summing up the report.
Can I just add one more thing? Another reason why the timing is why this is happening now is because until probably 2023, until the loss of Nagorno-Karabakh, Armenia's defense dependencies kind of also deepened due to that unofficial arms embargo on Armenia by the EU, USA, Canada, etc., which limited access to advanced Western weaponry because they PACE had also advised that they don't supply arms to conflict zones. So, it kind of in this weird loss of this conflict zone that kind of opened up the opportunity to procure these weapons.
Yeah, this unofficial embargo existed for decades, up until the Second Karabakh War, maybe even afterwards. But as we mentioned in the report, Azerbaijan has found alternatives to the Western military products like Israel, Turkey, which is technically a NATO member states. One last thing I should mention probably is that even this diversification has been happening. We need to understand that this is an ad hoc process. This is more of a reaction to the evolving geopolitical developments. If the Russo-Ukrainian war didn't started, I think Armenia wouldn't start this diversification process. We also forgot to mention about the arms deal contract with Russia. So basically, Armenia signed a significant arms procurement contract with Russia in 2021 with a huge advance payment, and Russia has been unable to deliver on the contract, and that's one of the reasons why Armenia is willing and capable to look for alternatives, because prior to that, even this desire to find alternative markets was politically sensitive. I remember years ago, even before the revolution, I think it was probably 2013 or 2014, Armenia's defense minister traveled to China just to see what they have or what options exist in this country. And I remember how the Russian propaganda press reacted to that, basically blaming Armenia even for the desire or the willingness to look for something else. So now when Russia itself is not capable of delivering on its contract, it's easier politically. So
one more thing I wanted to add, kind of to your point about the process of these new procurements being ad hoc, that necessarily means that, you know, it's acquiring these new weapons that are of a completely different paradigm, and, you know, even like the mortar and artillery millimeter sizes are completely different. It's a completely different kind of system. So you have this kind of period of time in the Armenian armed forces where there's a mix of the Soviet-Russian weaponry and then these new Western weapons existing in the same armed forces at the same time. So that requires really kind of a strategic approach to accommodate both, to, you know, carry on training and maintenance of the old equipment plus training and you know, operational training of the new equipment. So that's a challenge that the armed forces is dealing with now.
Yeah, absolutely. And we point at the Ukraine example as a good example for that, when
as a model
yeah, where they have been able to combine all these types of weaponry. So summing up the report, do you think the Armenian government has the political will and the capabilities to implement these recommendations or solutions? From our standpoint, I would like to mention that we have been trying to engage with decision makers with this report, but not just in the case of this report, but we didn't see any willingness to basically engage. We had a public event, we invited speakers, nobody turned up or even probably replied to our emails. So is there this willingness and capability to implement some of these recommendations, which are not like unique? I'm pretty sure that a lot of other experts talk to them and they basically come up with similar recommendations.
Yeah, I think definitely the recognition that these changes need to be made is probably there among at least, you know, certain policymakers. Whether you know, the approach is one of kind of concerted, you know, with the goal in mind to diversify, is pursued, you know, efficiently. I think also depends a lot on the geopolitical environment. I think the government's been actually quite careful not to make too big of a deal of some of the diversification and kind of, you know, reducing the reliance on Russia in certain areas. But economically, Armenia doesn't really have a choice right now, and there's not much substance, particularly with regards to energy. There aren't many short-term solutions, but if, you know, adapt or really like fall behind, because these changes are vital to Armenia's sovereignty and security, and they're long-term, which requires long-term thinking and strategy.
Yeah, I would disagree that they are cautious and they are trying not to irritate, particularly the Russians. I think in a lot of cases they talk the talk, but they don't
walk the walk.
Walk the walk. So that at times there's too much talk and no actual solutions or actions. In the final part of the episode, I would like to talk about another initiative we've been engaged in, the Democracy Watch initiative, our partnership, our cooperation with CivilNet, where we highlight the worrying trends in Armenia's democratic trajectory. So we've been writing this report for already how many months? 5 months. And what are your main impressions? What are the most urgent and worrying trends when it comes to Armenia's democratic consolidation process?
There are many worrying trends. I think one of the things we've uncovered, or at least I've uncovered, because you've been working in the think tank sphere for a bit longer than I have, in going to meetings with other civil society members, in particularly analysts, I have found, and you know, this is something that you know, this kind of worrying lack of critical thinking about certain government policies, and presenting a very kind of rosy picture to external partners, without including the worrying trends as kind of an intrinsic part, because they're not kind of exceptions. They're becoming more common and more like patterned, and that's something that is worrying. I think as someone with a kind of sociological background, what worries me also is the rhetoric that the government is using, targeting vulnerable groups like refugees from Karabakh, other vulnerable groups. The sort of language, the polarizing language that the government and also opposition faction leaders use is incredibly damaging to democratic development. Armenia is a country that relies really a lot on personal politics, personalistic politics, and that comes at the detriment of developing democratic institutions, because ideally you want to have a system in which it doesn't matter who's in power, the system kind of keeps working. But we don't have that, and you see that both in the opposition and in the government, the personalistic politics. So, and the rhetoric that is being used is it doesn't allow, it squeezes out room for nuance and talking to one another and talking across divides and understanding where other people's grievances come from, even if you don't agree with it. I think as a society, you live in a society and you're all in it together, so you need to work with other people, and that's just not happening.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree that when you use this kind of rhetoric, you basically delegitimize your political opponents and create space for anti-constitutional, anti-democratic measures. Karina, thank you for a very interesting conversation.
Thank you.